Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Economics of the Mainframe, the first of 4 panel discussions that we're going to be having here as part of the Information Week Virtual Summit, Mission Essentials for the Application Economy, which is being broadcast by UBM and sponsored by CA Technologies. I'm Lenny Liebman of Information Week. I'm going to be your host throughout today's very special event. I'm just going to take a moment now to explain to you how your interface works. First of all, the slides will advance for you automatically throughout the event. We don't have many of them, but they will advance for you. You can also download a copy of them by clicking below the media player. By the way, at this time, we recommend please disable your pop-up blockers so you can use all the interactive features of this interface. You can also submit questions at any time by just typing them into the Q&A window. Please don't wait until the Q&A session that we're going to have after our discussion here to get those questions in. If you hear anything any of our speakers say at any time that you want to ask about or challenge, please feel free to go ahead and do so. Finally, if you're experiencing any technical problems, just, again, type your issue into that same Q&A text area, and we'll be glad to provide you with some one-on-one assistance. So now on to the presentation, the economics of the mainframe. We have a couple of superb panelists with us today. Matt Eastwood is Senior Vice President, Enterprise Infrastructure of Data Center at IDC. He and his team have done some phenomenal research on how people, processes, and technologies are impacting the business results that we're getting from our enterprise infrastructure across the mainframe and our hybrid cloud environments. He's actually got some fresh research that we're going to be sharing with you as part of this event. So please, if you want to ask Matt some questions, get them in now. We're also privileged to have with us Ashok Reddy, who is General Manager of CA Technologies' CA Mainframe Business Unit. So Ashok is therefore responsible for CA's entire portfolio of mainframe software products and is currently applying his 30-plus years of industry experience and expertise to helping enterprises address the intensifying challenges of digital transformation and competitive success in, again, what we're calling the application economy. Gentlemen, I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Me too.
Great. So let's do this. Let's start maybe, Matt, by you setting some context about what is it that enterprises need to do more generally to compete, to survive in, again, this application economy in digital marketplaces.
I'd be pleased to do that. So about 7 or 8 years ago, IDC started to talk about this inflection, the shift from second to third platform. And the second platform was really kind of characterized by more of a client-server model. And the third platform is really heavily about analytics and mobile and cloud. And what we start to see happening today is a desire to drive new types of speed into the business and scale in ways that we haven't seen before. And a lot of this centers on data and data as a weapon. So the discussion with enterprises is really about digital transformation, how they're going to transform their business layer, and then what does that mean to the applications that an enterprise would leverage to differentiate in this digital world, and then most importantly, as the infrastructure guy, what does that mean for infrastructure? What does your infrastructure need to look like? What do your teams need to look like? Your people, your process? How do you get ready for what's about to happen in our industry?
Right. So what you're saying is sort of the business pressures that are going on are putting new pressure on us to manage and design our infrastructure in some fundamentally different ways?
Yeah, so it drives scale in ways that we've never seen before. It drives a need for levels of security that we haven't had to think about before. So think about this in terms of the more traditional way that we might think of a data center. We have systems of record. We have systems of engagement, though those engagement systems are very quickly rotating to mobile. There's an awful lot of focus on creating that mobile interface and creating new ways to engage with customers and with partners. And then what that drives is a desire to use data in new ways, so that systems of insight engine, how you can inform decision-making in the business, drive that decision-making deeper down into the business, and connect all of that back to the systems of record that are used to really align and drive business process.
Right. And that's requiring us to invest in what different types of infrastructure, different tools to manage the infrastructure, different ways of managing infrastructure? How does that actually impact how we're allocating our budgets?
I think it does get into tools, for sure. I mean, there's what I would say is in the 50-plus years that our industry has existed, very little actually goes away. We tend to continue to extend existing models. So it's looking at the platforms that we have, the applications that we have, and how we want to extend them for this third platform. And so a lot of it does come down to tools. It also comes down to how you think about people and process and how you start to re-engineer the IT organization itself so that it can be a bit more agile and a bit more adept at kind of onboarding applications at a rate that we've never really seen in our industry before.
And it's not just onboarding applications, right? There's something about, for example, real-time analytics that behaves differently than an application used to behave, right?
Yeah, and I would add another kind of layer of complexity would be around sort of IoT and the redefinition of the edge. So we've spent, I would argue, the better part of the first 5 decades of our industry really connecting people and automating processes around people. But now we're driving the sensification of the business much, much deeper. And so we're entering an era where we're going to start to think about where will this analytic work happen. And there's a lot of belief that it happens both at the edge and in the core. And it really needs to be staged at the edge to start to slim down and kind of create a more actionable set of data, and then bring that data back to the data center to really drive those business processes and really drive the decisions that mean something in the market.
So, Ashok, I'm going to ask you, now that we've talked about sort of the larger context, how does the mainframe actually fit? What is the role of the mainframe in the kind of environment that Matt is saying we have to build and create?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's an important question. I think when people think about mainframe, I think people don't think about it as, other than business critical applications, right? Everybody knows typically when you talk about mainframe, it thinks, okay, I've got some mission critical apps which need to run, 24/7, and it has 99.999 availability. And there are everybody thinks, okay, only there are certain class of applications which need that. But I think when you think about this third platform, what's happening with analytics, there are other set of things what happens. We find that there's almost 55% of the other apps, what I call a mission essential. Like if I'm a car manufacturer and I've got Internet of Things, I'm feeding the information back into my main server in the back end because they're processing all the information, they're doing diagnostics, they may be providing help. Those things are still mission essential, and they need to be running now 24/7. So there is more applications which need to have the same characteristics. Maybe they're not running your business all the time, but they are now important to do that. And the reason is also there is a lot of the data which is needed for this is still running on mainframe. More than 70% of the enterprise data sits on the mainframe or when you process. The reason is that people don't think about, hey, I'm going to use on Apple Pay or I'm using Venmo. But what happens is they don't realize in the back end what actually processes all that is a mainframe.
Yes.
So that's why the MIPS in the transactions is growing, and we find that more than 63% of the customers' MIPS in the mainframe is growing because of this new digital economy and the third platform, which is driving the growth in the back end.
Right. And it's easy to sit there and say, well, this is not a critical application because if a customer tries to execute a transaction and it doesn't happen, or they do a lookup and it doesn't happen, it's not a revenue loss. But customer experience is actually very key. So if we look at it from the point of view of the business decision maker or the customer, it feels critical to them.
Absolutely. I think sometimes when we separate out things like what's in the systems of record, and if you don't bring it into the experience, because I think real-time information, whether if you're going to going on a plane and you want to make a change to your tickets or a seat, a lot of it, the real-time experience comes in because you are integrated in the back end. You can make the change, or if you want to know what's been upgraded in business class, all that stuff, the experience, you don't have to go to the airport to find out. Yep. Now you can actually look at your mobile app. The reason is that it's actually connected in the back end to the mainframe.
And you're saying that you're seeing MIPS growth. So do you think that there's general sort of awareness on the part of the CIOs or SVPs of IT that their mainframe environment, again, rather than sort of languishing and containing vintage applications, is actually becoming more critical to their operations? I'm going to ask Ashok and then you about that. So what do you think is the awareness of growing
I think it is, to some extent, it's a very interesting question because I think many of us who have been brought up in the mainframe world, you kind of understand what happens and how it's being critical. But I think many of the CIOs, especially the newer generation who are coming through where they don't have as much exposure, only when they take over the job or they start looking at what's going on and they say, why am I still using mainframe? Why is our MIPS growing? And then they start understanding the critical nature of it, like for a bank or airline. They run their business on this. If I'm somebody who's processing transactions, I'm a credit card processor, they're all running on it. Retailers running on the entire business on it. And they know every minute downtime, or if I want to switch over to a backup system, if they're business critical systems, they know that there's not any other platform which is as economical and incremental cost is lower, like you talked about earlier this morning.
Right.
So that to me is where I think the awareness comes in once they start understanding, if I need to go and implement that now on another platform, can I get the same characteristics and the qualities of service? Why do I need to do that? Why don't I continue to use mainframe and it's the latest and best platform?
You want to talk about also kind of what's driving the MIPS and how people perceive the growth of the mainframe environment?
Sure. I mean, when you think about mainframes, I mean, one of the challenges is it's a platform or a set of technologies that have been around since the beginning of our industry. But the platform has evolved significantly over the years, and we're now almost 2 decades into Linux on the mainframe, as an example. So there was an early embrace of kind of open source technologies on the mainframe, but it was more than just embracing the code and the bits. It was really about how the system and the platform can be optimized to run that code. So more than 30% of all the MIPS in the market today are being deployed to run Linux workloads. And of course, there's lots of optimization in these mainframe platforms to help that code run efficiently. So there's also been a lot of work recently on extending the platform more broadly for the open source tools that are in vogue to help build and define these new third platform applications. So a lot of it does revolve around analytics and cognitive type of applications.
Right.
So there's a huge amount of focus there. There's a lot of focus around cloud and how, Ashok was talking about the mainframe as that central repository of business critical data. That's true. But there's lots of data that needs to be leveraged on these platforms that isn't inherently resident on a mainframe. So you're extending the platform out to the cloud, as I mentioned, Linux. And then mobile is the other one where you tend to see a lot of activity around mainframe in adjacencies, like say in the Java space, where there's a huge intersection in Java between the world of the mobile device and what's happening back in the data center.
So, and when you say to run more efficiently, to run Linux more efficiently, you're not just talking about from a technical point of view, also from a cost point of view, the way the pricing of the specialty processors, and so, I mean, it's
yeah. So the specialty processors are really priced to value, and they absolutely need to live in the context of a world that has multiple platforms available to an end consumer. So that's a big part of it. But there certainly are other aspects of the business value benefits of a mainframe around uptime. So if you think about just a platform that really has very little downtime, it has massive benefits to the business, of course. So there's not people waiting around for data services and access to information. It also has benefits to IT because you're not running around trying to triage and fix things. So when you start to look at business value of mainframe, it's pretty easy to make a business case when you start to look at the full context of the applications, particularly these high-value analytic applications.
Also, I find that, just to add to that, it actually is paradox. Actually, people think mainframe adds some complexity, but in this case, is actually simplifying it, because what happens is I can run 1 million Docker containers on a single instance of mainframe. And then when I want to do a backup or disaster recovery, think about from open systems, I've got thousands of servers, I need to apply patches, I need to back up something. Whereas in mainframe, you've got fewer people managing it. If it scales vertically, it's simpler. And that's why whether it's a NYPD or the state of California DMV, they're all running it on Linux and other things because it's simpler, it's cheaper, and then fewer people can manage that. And I can do a disaster recovery and backups very easily.
And we've seen that in our research as well. If you look at distributed environments and even the virtualization of distributed environments, when you start to relate administrative resources to those systems, we've actually seen the administrative costs in a lot of IT organizations increasing to the cadence of roughly every 24 months or so. They're seeing a 50% increase in the overall amount of resource. So essentially, what that suggests is the people and process that we use to manage our infrastructures are not keeping up with the technology. And mainframes, being a very centralized, highly scalable platform, certainly have lots of benefits when it gets into things like that. Yeah.
But haven't we, in the distributed environment, you talk about sort of everything that's done to patch and back up. Isn't it a little bit sort of a cognitive or cultural issue that we've gotten sort of so used to that's the way it is, that in a lot of IT organizations, they almost accept the fact that there's just a lot of care and feeding that have to be done of these machines. It's a little bit like frog in the boiling water thing, right? Is you say that it keeps scaling up, and yet the only solution generally posed to that is, okay, well, let's just get rid of it and sort of outsource all our distributed stuff to the cloud so we're not running around and doing it. But in the cloud, somebody else has to run around and do it. So you're still paying for it, even if it's indirectly, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a maturity component to the discussion, and what you'll tend to find are organizations that have mainframes installed tend to be quite mature. And when I say mature, I don't mean old. I mean they have very highly tuned processes around how they think about managing an infrastructure. So they tend to be quite efficient and much more efficient than the average IT user. So their ability to compete economically with the cloud tends to be much better than what you would find with more of say an SMB organization that maybe doesn't have the ability to really centralize and coordinate skill sets in the same way.
Yeah, they're not as long in the tooth. They haven't established best practices. So Ashok, then I want to ask you to shift a little bit while we're sort of singing the praises of the mainframe. Let's push on the problems, though. So are you seeing organizations really get the full economic and business value out of the mainframe that they could potentially, or are you seeing a couple of issues in particular where we can improve the economics of the mainframe?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I think most people, when they talk to customers who kind of are using or depend their business on the mainframe, there are some challenges. The first thing that people talk about is the cost and the economics of the platform. I think there is a perception of mainframe, because of the initial cost of whatever acquiring or whatever, what's the economics? And also, other thing what happens is it still tends to be one of the mainframe budget is seen as a single line item.
Yes.
So from a CIO perspective, they think that that's my single biggest line item. But even though it may be 10% of the IT cost, whereas other things are all smaller line items, there is other zillion things there. But what happens is everybody says, hey, I've got this 10%. And also the perception of, if we are not using mainframe as much, maybe we are moving a few workloads off. But what happens is they're not really moving a lot of the key workloads like billing and claims processing and transaction. There are some more like user interface type of things are moving, but it's not lowering the cost. So that's where I think a lot of it comes down to the challenges. I would say is first thing is cost and economics. How do I lower my cost? My MIPS is growing, but I don't want my budget to increase because of that, right? The second part is, I think you touched on this, which is really about the skills. People, with mainframe, there are a lot of people who have been in the mainframe business, but then people are retiring and other things. So the question is, how do I get new skills? Or how do I get people from a college? Right? That's the second problem. And then I think third one is really around business agility. I think Matt touched on this. So in this new world of third platform, everything is about getting things faster, right, to the market and getting feedback and how do I get this. So people don't think mainframe can provide that agility compared to the open and distributed systems. And the last one is, given the criticality of these systems, in which industries it's in, financial services and in all the government, security and regulations are becoming a problem because everybody thought mainframe was a Fort Knox. But increasingly, as you connect mainframe to all these other things, it was not initially supposed to be connected. Right now, you're connecting through all the networks and TCP/IP, all the problems of open systems.
Right.
You could get the same problems in mainframe.
And it's not just a question of sort of security and compliance in the classic sense of like hacking, but also the safety of your mainframe platform can potentially be jeopardized by this exposure. Because if somebody with a distributed application writes a piece of code that calls the mainframe database in a way that's not quite according to Hoyle, it in fact can have an impact on your entire performance and applications end to end.
Absolutely. I think the security is very important. And also I think, there's a privacy laws, and now many countries are saying I can't leave my data in my data center. And how do you make sure that, you don't allow the data to go beyond your borders? So there's a lot of those concerns which people have to address.
Well, if you think about the mainframe and again, that 50-year history, the context in, kind of that, what we would call first platform was really about walling off that data center and protecting what was inside. But to your point, Lenny, that's really not the world that we live in anymore. And this data is in motion. It's touching more and more devices. It's touching more and more systems. And definitely becomes an encryption game. It becomes a game of how you can secure this data in motion. And again, mainframes have really good security attributes when you start to think about the encryption of data, the encryption and decryption, and really securing data kind of throughout that whole life cycle as it travels around from the edge back to the core and back to the edge.
But the point I was also making was not just about security and compliance, but it's also sort of the threat to the performance in economics, right? So that these applications that are calling, if we do have these additional interfaces, and they can potentially threaten some of our cycles. I wanted to ask you something else, though, Matt, which is we were sort of extolling the virtues of the platform in terms of we've got these operational best practices that keep our our costs low in terms of maintenance, but to some extent. Having a set of very custom, recognized practices that we've established over a long period of time kind of works against us in terms of agility, right? Because we've learned to do things that 5 years ago or 10 years ago didn't have to be as agile. So isn't part of the obstacle with agility almost the same, the fact that we have established best practices, that we have to sort of maybe break some habits in order to become more agile on the mainframe?
Yeah, I think there are two things. One is back to a point that Ashok was making around how the market's evolved. And as the market evolved from a market that was really about mainframes and then mini computers into one that became about client server, I do think a lot of IT organizations kind of misread really what that meant in terms of economics, because you're breaking this highly integrated system down into quote unquote a kind of best of breed set of systems with a lot of merchant software, and when you start to add that all up and add up all those administrative costs, it doesn't look as attractive as a lot of people think. That's the economic piece. But when you start to think about the software itself, yeah, a lot of what's happening on the mainframe today is the creation of this ability to support a kind of a modern set of tools on top of a mainframe, so that these new DevOps models can really live in this highly centralized and highly coordinated world. So it's being able to offer people access to the open source technologies that we talked about, with sort of Linux being kind of an indicator, but also extending that to some of these next generation tools, whether it's Docker or Spark or even databases, MongoDB or MariaDB. So you're essentially allowing the world of the mainframe as a platform to really live and exploit a lot of the developments that are happening in that open source world as well. So the development world changes dramatically.
Yeah. And before we start talking about sort of solving the four challenges, because I think you did a good job of sort of taxonomizing our challenges in these four categories, Ashok, I want to ask kind of the same thing. To what extent do you see some of these problems or challenges facing us because the world has changed outside the mainframe, but within the mainframe world, our community that we're sort of serving today with the event has, resisted change in certain ways because, rightfully so. They saw distributed computing spring up around them and being very unreliable and non-secure, and we did have to sort of protect the crown jewels. I mean, that's not totally without foundation, and yet that protectionism, it's hard to transition to that, to saying, okay, not only do we have to change how we interface with you, but we ourselves may in fact have to learn from these upstarts, if you would, right? Do you see it as
I think so. I think it comes from, people always think about from the mainframe world, it's all about stability and making sure that, security is job number one, and the things what it runs, like whether it's a border security controls or airlines, so you don't have that appetite for taking risk, right? Typically what's happened is that, hey, I wanted to keep it stable. That's my number one goal. And I wanted to secure. So when you think about this agile and changes, people now think, oh my God, I'm going to introduce this thing into this thing, and my number one job is to keep it stable. Yeah. But at the same time, I think, when it looks at what customers are trying to do and what you're trying to grow, and when you want to get new business and learn, you can't operate the same way. I think as you connect things and you want to say, how do I enable mainframe also to be part of the same thing? Yes. Maybe you don't take as much risk, but you still want to enable experimentation, learn. But there are ways to do that, but generally that's where there is a need to have that stability versus, how do I bring agility?
So let's do that now. Let's go to the solution side. I think we've articulated the challenges, and what I'd like to do is maybe follow the same taxonomy as you did with the challenges, but let's take them one at a time. So how about we take economics first? And Ashok, I invite you to start first, and then Matt, you weigh in. What is it that we can do now to start to move the needle to further improve the economics of the mainframe?
Okay, I think the first part is, I think mainframe in terms of when we look at how one of the top costs for customers is what we call a monthly license charge, right? Typically, it's based on pay as you go, and IBM charges based on the peak usage. So one of the things IBM has done, and what people can take advantage of, is we talk about specialty engines. So if you run something on a core processor or mainframe, you end up paying higher dollar because of the MLC charges. If I write something in Java, for example, and it runs on a specialty engine, or if I have some databases I can run on a specialty engine, or if I move something to Linux, it saves customers money on paying the MLC charges, right? So one is to take advantage of the specialty engine. The second one is improving performance of all your apps and other things. So it's fit for purpose. So only have those sort of applications which need to be on mainframe, and being able to standardize on the software what you have, so it lowers the cost of managing, because it's people costs, right? What are the delivery costs of hardware, software, the MIPS, MLC charges? And then I would say it's also the cost of, you need to think about, people don't think about it for mainframe, what's the cost of my continuous business availability? So when you talk to a bank, when something like a hurricane hits or a 911 happens, they can switch over in 30 minutes to another data center. What's the cost of implementing the same thing somewhere else? So what's the economics of making sure that? So I think you'll have to think about some of the applications and solutions which also, mainframe, most customers don't go down, if they don't reboot. You ask a customer, when was the last time you rebooted intentionally? It's 20 years. Some people are running for 20 years, right? Because it has that. So I think economics is really, those are the type of things what people are looking at.
And I just want to, before you add your answer, Matt, I want to push on a couple of things. One of them is not everybody understands the nature of the monthly licensing charges, that your workload over here, workload A, how many MIPS you're using, affects your software charges for this whole set of software. It fundamentally is a different cost personality than we have anywhere else in computing, right?
Absolutely. It's almost like I equate that to, you take your electricity bill, summer, is the peak charges.
Yeah.
It's the highest charge in summer. And you take that and multiply the 12 months and say, this is your bill.
Yes.
Right? Instead, we'll say, you don't have to operate everything in a peak. Why don't I look at all the things you're doing? Are there things what you need to run? And maybe there's some things you can run in nighttime or in winter. So that's really how do we optimize it?
And although we've always been cost conscious, we may be entering a stage in the mainframe where we have to be more aggressive about how we manage that, because our MIPS overall are going up for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with the mainframe applications themselves. And therefore, as mainframe people, to sort of maintain what is our quote-unquote territory, we really have to look at this so that that little 10% line item that you were talking about, it's all about, so that doesn't keep growing and somebody's scratching their head and saying, why is this growing? So we have to be more proactive about looking at MSUs.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think management and automation becomes a huge part of all of this, whether we're talking mainframe or any platform. But the mainframe in particular is really always been a set of technologies that really encouraged a level of utilization that we've seen probably nowhere else in the data center. So it's definitely in the customer's best interest to maintain a very high level of utilization, but also to maintain a level of alignment with the optimization of the platform for the workload. So as the workloads change, as the tool sets become a bit more open and exposed to some of these next-gen frameworks that we talked about, the mainframe is keeping pace and allowing customers to install the right acceleration engines to really optimize that code and keep those utilization rates up. But I would say the other thing that's always been a concern in the kind of mainframe domain has been access to people. And there's a lot of work that's been done by CA, by IBM, by others in terms of building those skills out in universities. But when you start to think about what's happening in the application layer and the move towards more of an open source ecosystem, that helps take care of that as well. The platform becomes relevant for a set of technologies that it never lived in a domain or environment that it never lived inside of before. So that helps take care of some of those concerns around access to people who can build applications that will take full advantage of the mainframe.
Good. You jumped to the second topic, so that's good. So, Ashok, I'll let you respond to that too. That was actually, I think, the third one you mentioned. But let's go ahead and talk about skills, because it really is an issue, not only in terms of sort of familiarity with the platform, familiarity with the languages that are different languages. What do you see as ways to sort of address this skills gap?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things which is sort of people don't realize is with the mainframe, it actually supports Java. You can run on both ZOS and now with Linux and the open mainframe. it can support pretty much any open language. But even if I look at the ZOS, people can bring, they can use open technologies such as Eclipse, for example, because when people come out of college, they learn these IDEs. They can use that. They can use Java. They can use any open technologies, even including like Spark and other things to do the data processing. Because when you process a transaction, you may have to do fraud alerts. You need to give some loyalty points. All those things you may not have to run on the OS itself because to the MLC charges, but maybe you can co-locate them with something else. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is, I think increasingly as people retire and others, and also as companies, so IT are looking at not having specialist tool people in admins and everything like I'm managing tape, I'm managing this. They're looking at, tell me, how do I manage this thing without having to know all the intricacies of mainframe? Because you've got people from distributed background and college. So they're looking for expert systems. I know my storage is getting full. I'm going to have a performance problem. Tell me before it even happens. Right? Why do I need to know, and what's my best cost for storage? And looking at the holistically, my performance, my network, my storage. I think it's more and more you'll find that it's the skills can be solved not just by training people and getting the right things, but also how do we make it easy for them to look at holistically, provide more of how do I reduce the amount of time it takes to troubleshoot some things. So you want to move more and more towards I call machine learning based thing. You can learn over a period of time, and then that can be used to reduce the need for this specialized skills at the tool level.
And I think that's going to be, at our third panel, we're going to be talking about operational analytics. So I encourage you, if you're interested in drilling down more about that, be with us for our third session where we talk about how analytics can actually help insulate operators from all this underlying complexity. Okay, we jumped from 1 to 3. Let's go back to 2, which again, we're going to discuss in the next session, actually, agility. But I am interested in, from the ops point of view, since we're talking about the platform in particular, what you think we can do to increase the agility with which mainframe teams respond to the constantly changing needs of the business. Matt, I'm going to let you go first on this one, and then Ashok.
Okay, I'll pick up on where Ashok left off in terms of really think about the domain teams in the data center. A lot of it does come down to how you restructure and realign resources. So you don't have those silos of compute, network, security, storage, that they're thought of as kind of one set of one team that's really able to action on all those resources. So that becomes a really big component of really how you become more agile. If you think about where the market's going, IDC would say by 2020, somewhere more than 2/3 of all IT spend will be what we call third platform. But what will drive that is this digital transformation that we talked about up front. So if you think about how quickly the business will change and what kind of stresses that's going to put on the applications and infrastructure layer, you definitely need to start to think about retooling the organization and also retraining around next-gen tools to take full advantage of what's out there and how you should think about really creating the agility in the data center to support these new gens of applications.
And again, what are you thinking about agility and speed? We've got a whole session coming up on it, but anything you want to share about it?
No, I think it's a very important. I think it's really, bringing the same agility what people do in the kind of a mobile and other application development, and how do I manage that? You need the same thing on the mainframe side, right? Because what happens, one of the differences, people say I can't apply the same principles of agility in DevOps to mainframe, because the big problem is when I develop something and I want to test something, it's only when you deploy to the mainframe, because of the stability issues, people are kind of leery of, do I put this in here? So how do I actually, one of the things what we think about is shift left, right? That is, how do I create a production-like environment in a test environment so that I can develop, test, and get feedback before I deploy?
Yes.
So that's how you become continuous delivery, right? You can do that in mainframe. People don't realize that. And then you can automate, deployment. You can get feedback, and then so that friction between what my development test is done in a completely different environment than my production environment, that needs to be reduced. And then you can do continuous testing and other things. So that's really, to me, the agility comes because you can apply the same principles, but you need to enable that shift left. And then the last part is more about, how do I modernize things, right? Because sometimes the speed is a problem in mainframe because a lot of things have been written in legacy languages. So if you actually rewrite some of them or refactor some of them to Java, or if you want to take some of the newer, like instead of assembler, Metal C, that also, it becomes agility, because then you have a more broader pool of skills. There's tools you can use, modern tools you can use versus doing it in assembler. So I think you have to look at the different aspects of it.
And again, we'll talk about more of that in a session. We also have our last session today is going to be on security, but Ashok, since you brought it up, I'm just going to invite you just for a minute to share about anything in particular that you think in terms of security and compliance are key steps that our community can start taking now to keep the mainframe safe and compliant, even though it's opened up more.
Yeah, no, I think, one of the things with mainframe, I think Matt talked about, the system itself is designed for the highest class of security, encryption, other things. The problem is now, because of the connection of mainframe to the external systems and the applications what people have, so how do I make them secure now, right, in this context of connected applications and mobile and IoT? So I think that's there. One aspect is, how do I actually make sure that people who build these things, it's not just the application, it's the people aspect. You need to know who has access to what, who has touched what, and all that stuff. So you want to make sure that you're able to look at the people aspects, and people can walk away with, who has got, sometimes when somebody leaves a company, their systems are not turned off, for example, right? So how do you know what was touched, what's not? So there is that more of a discovery of, what I call a content discovery. Data is the security of the data and who has access to it. The second part is the whole safe harbor law and where the data could be and who has access to it. So I would say that's one aspect. And the second one is the auditability and security. Whenever I talk to customers, they spend 1/3 of their resources in mainframe on reporting, right? Because of all the post-financial crisis, auditing and industry regulations have increased tremendously. So every bank, every airline, everybody is reporting a lot more every day. So how do I look at what needs to be reported, and how do I automate those things, and how do I reduce the work what people have to do on non-value added work?
Anything you want to add? Go ahead.
No, I think that's a great point, particularly around compliance and how compliance doesn't really in and of itself add value to any organization. So you'll tend to see are a lot of companies and any type of organization really trying to increase the momentum around how they can complete audits and actually build these compliance reports, as Ashok was saying. That becomes really key for everybody that's in this space.
Yeah. So are you guys ready to take some questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a little time left for questions. If you haven't gotten one in yet, please go ahead and send it in. Again, if we don't answer it right here live, we'll do it offline. One of the questions I'm getting is interesting, and Matt, I'm going to direct it to you. When we talk about sort of the mainframe as a back-end server, the person asking the question is, to what extent is it a back-end server where it's just serving data versus utilizing the sort of business logic components within mainframe applications? I think it's a good question, because there is a difference, a fundamental performance and technical difference between just making a database call than there is in actually utilizing application logic modules.
Yeah, the historic value and of the mainframe really has been around that relationship between the business app and the back-end database.
Right.
And you do tend to still see an awful lot of affinity in terms of what runs on a mainframe natively or in some of these new enhanced environments, being around how that ERP or supply chain management or accounting or finance or whatever type of application that's resident on the platform is really constructed in terms of being able to make those data calls and manage that kind of overall data flow. So there's still a high degree of a relationship between what's happening in that application layer and what's happening in that back-end database layer.
And also, I think, I would find that there is also, it's not just about data, because there is literally 200 billion lines of code there, right, in COBOL and others. You find that many of these business rules are in the code, right? Whether it's insurance policy, my premium rates, or my... So what happens is, it's not just about data, it's how do I apply those business rules and the logic, and also what you already have to leverage. So it's closer, it's faster, and you can manage, you're talking about billions of transactions a day in many cases.
Yep.
So in that case, it makes sense to continue to use those and leverage them, enhance them, but it's not just about data, but also leveraging the logic, business logic you already may have.
And I think that you touched on this, Ashok, but the whole notion of moving the data and the processing closer together actually is something that's really important to the future of the mainframe, because when you start to think about real-time decision making, it really is about how close you can align that actionable data with those core cycles and with the applications themselves. So that really becomes the differentiation in the kind of digital transformation that's happening.
As opposed to shipping massive amounts of data somewhere else.
Right.
But you mentioned business rules, so the natural question is that's where the agility is, though, right? So it's not that you have to sort of make these major changes to applications, which is what we tend to think of with infrequent code drops. We tend to think of sort of bundling a lot of requests, right, and putting them in a big drop. Business rules, I have to change very quickly if I'm in insurance or something to write a policy, because that's my ability to get a product to market, right? So somehow we have to improve our ability to change these business rules.
Absolutely. I think, people have taken different attacks to it. You don't want to embed the actual business, data, rules there, but you want to be able to maybe even create some APIs. You can get some things like containers nowadays and make it more of the one unfortunate thing with mainframe, because of the monthly license charge and economics, people have designed the application sometimes to overcome the economics of the problem versus what's the best architecture, how do I locate them versus if I build it this way, I'm going to save on monthly license charge.
Yes.
So it's a sort of an unfortunate side effect.
Yeah.
But if you think about real-time data, bringing it together and the rules and how do I, with more and more memory being cheaper, I can do a lot more in-memory calculations and be faster.
And so what you're saying is this is also a reason for us to kind of push on the economics, because if we push the economics down, then we actually have the freedom to do some agility in code and how we process.
Yeah, I think that is to me. I mean, I find many of the people have designed things to really come around and say, I'm using this many LPARs because I need to save. It doesn't cost me as much.
Right.
Not C charges.
One of the questions is, can I overcome a lot of these problems by just outsourcing? I'm going to ask you both to comment on that, Ashok, first. So can I solve some of sort of my skills and my cost problems by just outsourcing this, putting the burden on somebody else?
Well, I think, there are outsourcing has got multiple aspects of it, right? So there is the infrastructure part of the mainframe. So if I want to outsource, I don't want to deal with the infrastructure, managing upgrades and all the things. That's one aspect. So I know there are a lot of systems integrators who do this. They're very good at it. But generally, that's one aspect. But then you have the innovation and application, the business aspects of it. So do you outsource the app development? So some customers tend to outsource the infrastructure, but they get to keep the, I know one of the largest automobile manufacturer insourced everything now, and they're very happy because they get to control the innovation speed, but they work with the outsourcer on the infrastructure. So I think what we have found is typically the smaller MIPS companies tend to outsource that way. But generally, people who are in the sort of a digital world and rapidly evolving, they kind of balance that with, I can do that myself, part of the development and others, and maybe I outsource that. So that's really, it doesn't really solve all the problems in terms of, it's like you get the agility, sometimes you lose that also. Because when you outsource, now you have to go through somebody else to put together, hey, I request, let me provision a system, I need to now go through a purchase order request instead of saying, I can in self-service. Create a test environment. So
I totally agree with the size of the footprint being a big component of the decision. So anybody that has kind of medium to large scale, when you start to think about mainframes and MIPS, probably isn't going to be in the business of turning that over. I think Ashok's absolutely right. It has a big impact on agility, and if you think about how quickly the pace of innovation is going to be required to occur in the future, it can potentially hinder that a bit. But I guess what I would say is when you start to think about this, if it's core to your business and the applications that you're putting on this platform are really areas that you're focusing to differentiate in your business in this new world, those are probably things that you want to hold on to. And that's what we tend to see.
Coming up to the end of our time, I'm going to give you each 30 seconds for any final word you want to share before I sign off. Matt, anything you want to share in closing?
I think the speed that this differentiation needs to occur is pretty significant. So if we think about how fast disruption is happening in our markets, it's pretty significant. So what we tend to see is folks trying to really own and differentiate around what truly makes a difference to their business, and keep an eye on what that digital transformation will look like. And we already see today that about 60% of the global 100 have these digital teams that are thinking kind of end-to-end around what digital process looks like for them. We expect that goes to 90 in another 12 to 18 months. So this is a really big thing. And if you start to think about the case for disruption in any industry, technology is at the root of that. And so owning that next-gen digital model, that mobile model, that IoT data stream, and thinking thinking about how to connect that all back to those systems of record and the systems of insight is really key. So very little goes away. It really becomes about how you optimize for that future. But think about what that future state looks like and begin developing the skills today that you'll need for that world.
Good. Same thing. 20, 30 seconds closing statement?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, for me, the mainframe has a fit for purpose. It is sort of the, one of the things when we talk about mission critical and mission essential. So I think there is in a company when they look at it, instead of looking at this as a separate thing and it's going to go away or whatever, but really more and more when you look at all these things, what we're doing, it really has a fit for purpose. You can create mainframe as a service to make it agile, all the things we talked about, some economics. Agility is a big thing people talk about, but we ourselves at CA, we have got more than 100 Scrum teams on mainframe, and we deliver software every quarter. So I think you can do that. There are a lot of best practices, there are solutions which can explore even in this forum today. But I would just say that instead of, why don't we leverage the most critical assets in your company in the context of this sort of a third platform and digital transformation?
Yeah. I'm going to agree, especially with what you said there, Matt. To me, this is like the Y2K problem. In Y2K, we were just to have the same deadline, we were worried about some lines of code breaking. This is your business breaking.
Right.
So I think we need to apply sort of the same or greater urgency to this as we did to the other stuff. But we do have to wrap up. So I'll thank you for attending today's presentation, The Economics of the Mainframe, first of our 4 panel discussions that we're having as part of this Information Week Virtual Summit, Mission Essentials for the Application Economy, which is broadcast by UBM, sponsored by CA Technologies. Up next, in just 30 minutes, will be a session on mainframe DevOps. So this agility issue will be really important. And I think you'll find it very fascinating and informative. So please join us then. And as always, we strongly encourage you to make full use of all the resources we've provided as part of this virtual event, including peer-to-peer chat, informative short videos. You can also join in the social conversation. I think we have a hashtag Mainframe Summit. So go ahead and tweet. Just so you're aware, in the next 24 hours, you're going to receive a personalized follow-up email and a link to today's presentation on demand. Very helpful if you want to share this content with someone who you report to you or who reports to you. And I also have to tell you once again that the presentation is copyright 2016 by UVM. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Information Week or CA Technologies, and that our individual speakers today are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. So on behalf of Ashok and Matt, thanks so much for your time. I'm Lanny Liebman. See you again in 30 minutes for another live unscripted panel discussion, this time about DevOps and Agile Ops on the mainframe. See you then.